Hello, everyone. I'm Bob Leedy, CEO of the ANA, the Association of National Advertisers. And we're here today to talk about several subjects around data, artificial intelligence, media, and creative, and how they all intersect together and essentially lead to what we are focused on is about driving growth, organic growth. And with me today are two experts and senior executives in the area. Please welcome James Slezak, the CEO from Swayable, and Catherine Ratchey, who is a partner at McKinsey's. So we are going to jump right into it. So as I said, guys, thank you for being here. The setup is we're in about driving growth. Driving growth for businesses and brands is the cornerstone of what marketers are most interested in. And we recognize that two of the hottest subjects on the planet right now are data and AI. Let's start with data. When you look at the totality of what marketers are doing, looking at the continuum of acquiring the most data we can and the highest quality data, how are we stacking up on that continuum? Catherine, let's start with you.
Yeah, I fundamentally believe that being able to have quality data and then act on it is going to be what separates, leaders and laggers in the future. And I think in retail, where I spend a lot of time, many companies over the last few years with COVID were necessitated, major investments in their data. And so I would say, we're still on a journey. I have some of my clients that are definitely leading the way here in terms of modernizing their data warehouses, going through the process of cleaning legacy data systems, right, reimagining, who their partners need to be in a privacy right ecosystem from data. But then I have many other companies that still are behind on this. And I think it's only going to become even more important in the next few years. And so a place where a lot of clients need to spend, more time and attention than they already are.
So you're saying there's a great divergence in the ability to harness that level of data to optimize those results.
Absolutely.
Yeah. James, how do you feel about this?
Yeah, I think we've graduated from the Mad Men era where people just have a great idea and, the most charismatic or highest paid person in the room sort of wins. And we had this era for, I think, sort of 10, 15 years where people realized data can let you make better decisions. But I think we're moving from that era to one where people have realized that that's mostly been applied at the bottom of the funnel.
Right.
And you can see a click-through rate or a conversion very easily. So you can optimize that stuff really easily. And people spend a lot of time thinking about how to do that. And all our favorite ad platforms really were there to help us, right, because that drove their businesses as well. But I think this is a creative festival. And I think this community is really in the last few years, and I think Swable's tried to be a contributor to that conversation, realize that you have to measure the impact of bigger stories, not just the bottom of the funnel, but the stories that create the demand that flows through to that part of the funnel in the first place. Big ideas about brands and what they mean, their purpose, products, and why they're exciting. So I think there's a transition to thinking about how to answer that question, right? And I think that's where there's been less focus in the past, but increasing focus now.
So as you look at the landscape and the environment that we're in, what do you see as kind of the barriers to optimizing data management?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is this sort of fallacy we call the streetlight fallacy, where people feel comfortable that there's lots of numbers flying around,
right,
but not always have they stopped to say, well, do these numbers really prove that I'm meeting my business goal?
Right.
And I think you have to do that. Anyone that's taking good decisions, and obviously Catherine's work is about advising folks doing that, recognizes that you have to be intentional about what the analysis proves. And to do that for the large stories, the stories that win Cannes Lions awards, takes a more intentional form of experimentation. It takes really probing deeper, not just getting lots of data, but actually getting data that answers the question, am I generating lift? Am I generating demand? The brand equities that this campaign's about, are they landing? So that's what a lot of our work's about.
To build on that a little bit, measurement has often come into the equation,
mm-hmm,
and you talked about developing the creative side of it. Yet, do we have the right tools and structures in order to be able to find that right data that can help make those types of decisions? How do you feel about that, Catherine?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I think a lot of our clients really struggle with the connection between some of these things, right? And you have almost an asymmetrical information, right? Where you have a ton of information about a little bit,
yeah,
and not a lot of information about the full funnel. And I think, a lot of the barriers that we see our clients fall into is not having a comprehensive strategy, not solving for specific use cases, and kind of letting the tools and letting the available data almost dictate what their strategy
right,
is versus starting with what they're trying to achieve. And I think you have to be very intentional about it. And then I think the other thing that we see a lot of folks struggle with is how do you actually connect that from your data through to your MarTech and to your ad tech and then back. And a lot of times they'll focus just on one of those silos and not think about kind of how you connect that through the entire stack and what that feedback loop looks like. And so we're spending a lot of energy with our clients really solving for specific measurement use cases and trying to help them understand the relationships between what seems like a lot of times like different answers coming from different tools and how do they make sense of it.
Let's build on that a little bit. And you introduced the ad tech community. And as we think about the stream of data, there's been a lot of criticism about the opacity of data, transparency issues that exist. And as we need to be able to make decisions, particularly about media and media investments, and the investments that run from marketer to consumer, transparency has always been talked about as being an issue. Can you comment a little bit about that?
Yeah. I mean, I think there's a couple different, angles on transparency, right? There's the consumer, vantage point, which is, what is the company actually collecting on me?
Right.
What are they doing with it? I think obviously there's been a lot of attention with that, with a lot of the privacy regulations, but I do think, depending on what your setup is and your relationship, either of what you in-house or what you do with your agency partners or other partners, you have more or less information, right? And if you think about, where a lot of the growth in media has been lately with some of the walled gardens, with a lot of the RMNs, which are growing like crazy, they're actually least transparent compared to, at least today, compared to some of the other channels that you have. And so I feel like this is going to be an ongoing challenge as you navigate this with the fragmentation of your channels and trying to actually connect that back. And I think a lot of our clients are still struggling with this and trying to figure out what is that right setup, what is the right clean room or data partnership setup where I can actually get some of that information back, and how do I work with my partners to get information that will help me optimize not only in their environment but connected across channels, but obviously doing that in a consumer privacy right way.
Right.
And then, I mean, to build on the consumer angle, and we're thinking a lot also about the transparency around the actual enterprise itself, which obviously Catherine is as well. And part of what's hard about that question is it's a difficult ask. Not everyone wants to know if something didn't work, especially when you've got differentiated roles, agencies who build stuff, and then it's actually quite a difficult ask to say, hey, what about I come back a month later and tell you that work was a waste of effort and time, all those great ideas. Sometimes it is, unfortunately. Other times a better idea would have been better. So our way of addressing that is to recognize that actually the pain point there is like, if you can't act on that information, then of course it's a terrible experience for everybody involved. And folks in the creative industries end up having this sort of almost strained relationship with data because it is so unactionable if it comes at the end of a 2-month later brand lift study. So by delivering that to people the next day, that's one way of helping with that, because you can now use it. It's not a sort of someone grading your homework a month later. It's actually part of your process. But I think it's also where the professional services and advice and change management comes in, because now you actually need a different creative process. You need a different marketing operation setup to take advantage of that.
I think that's so true, though, because I do think a lot of creatives almost feel threatened by information as opposed to kind of embracing it as part of their process. And I think part of it is the historical, to your point, it would come 2 months, 3 months later, and you couldn't actually do anything with it. But now that we have the ability to get a lot more information in real time and do a lot more pre-testing, like I think the ones that can embrace that and make that kind of part of their DNA are the ones that will be successful.
I was just
please.
I mean, the thing that I find really exciting is when I talk to creatives who, for the first time, are hungry for the data, because now they're able to take more risks. And creatives hate having 15 stakeholders in the room telling them that their ideas, not safe and too edgy. Everyone wants to try something new and interesting. So you end up with these creative concepts that get sort of, committee sort of processes sort of landing on the lowest common denominator. But when you can say, hey, you know what, I'm going to test something. We'll know tomorrow if my idea is so crazy. Now the processes can let them do that, and you find campaigns that I think are a lot more interesting. Creatives' work can be a little bit less navigating the safe committee outcome and more getting the data.
Interesting. So if you were both advising the client-side marketers, and the goal and objective was to essentially figure out how to optimize data for planning, for investment decisions, what would you tell them to do?
Well, of course, step one is use Swavel for everything. Of course I'm going to say that. But no, I think it's right. You have to think about the full funnel, which Catherine's an expert on. And I think we play a role in that, but not every role. You have to say, look, at each stage, what is this activity? What is its business objective?
Right.
And if you're very clear about that, and then you have, does this metric that I've got access to correctly measure the performance against that business goal? I think that's a good place to start.
Right.
And the other thing we would add is have a lot of skepticism around that. I think part of my background, and Valerie, who's my co-founder, we were actually scientists originally, and our training was experimental science. And part of, I think, why we had a bit of a contribution here was because I think that sort of skeptical, inquiring approach that you learn in science, we noticed it wasn't necessarily the default mode of a lot of the technology or the data that was in the marketing space. That a lot of people would there's sort of experts over there and they say something and I don't really understand it, but okay, you let me know what the right decision is. And we try to say to folks, if we're saying something that doesn't make sense, that's our fault.
Right.
You ask hard questions, make sure we're accountable for you getting an answer that you understand and that makes sense.
Catherine, what do you think? Because it's a big challenge for marketers. So how would you advise them?
I think kind of two things. I think one, what I mentioned before about being very use case back. So what are the questions I'm actually trying to answer? What is the information I need to do so? And what are the full technology roadmap that I need? But I think the second thing, which we find a lot of folks don't focus on as much, which is what are the process changes that I actually need to take advantage of that, right? Because if you're setting up all that information and technology and data, but you're not actually injecting it into your process, you're not changing your budgeting processes to actually be able to get that information back, right? You're not changing creative processes and the change management around it. And we feel like a lot of times people focus too much almost on the perfect data, the perfect tech, and they don't spend enough time on what's the true process changes I need. How do I actually set up my marketing teams to be able to move agile so that they can, get information, read, react, and change? Because if not, then you're just basically measuring and getting data for the sake of it, but not actually doing anything differently with it. And that's where we see a lot of folks have those downfalls.
Well, when you look at your client list, and without saying anything confidential, are there examples that you've seen companies do to do exactly what you suggested them to do?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, what I would say what separates out those that actually achieve it is a full cross-functional team that actually understands it, right? And so it takes a lot of partnership. Obviously, your marketing exec needs to be a huge sponsor and believer in this, but it takes a lot of partnership from your tech partners, from your data partners, but also from finance and from the business, right? Because we often find that finance is one of the overlooked stakeholders in all of this. And if you're thinking about media spending and allocation, it's really needs to be your partner in crime, and they need to understand what you're trying to achieve, the importance of marketing, and you don't want to necessarily feel like you have to constantly, convince them, right? You want them at the table with you. And I find that a lot of my clients kind of forget about their CFO, or they're almost hiding from their CFO as opposed to, inviting them in for the journey.
I think the CFOs may be hiding from them.
Yeah, maybe. Some of them probably.
Let's drift into a somewhat related subject, AI. I mean, it's obviously the hot button in today's universe. We're all talking about it here at Cannes. Every other session seems to be about AI. So I'm going to ask it a little differently. What's the big deal about AI? And is this the next shiny object that we're moving into? Is it really a big deal for marketing?
Well, look, I think it's an enormous deal. I think a lot of folks are just blown away by things being possible now that we didn't think we would ever see in our lifetime. So I think, look, the tech industry has made a profession out of generating hype, but it's a little bit like the boy who cried wolf. They've got a probably generational breakthrough here, I think. And, this time there's really a wolf. I think it changes everything. I mean, it's really like a computer. It's like, how did that change jobs? Well, basically every job was redesigned in some way to take advantage of it. I think we're starting to see those experiments happen now. I mean, obviously, if you're creating copy, why not get a first draft?
Sure.
If you're summarizing meetings, why not have it summarized in meetings? If you're generating variants of ideas, why not plug it in? We're really excited about ways that it actually gets you more insights out of real people. So Swable is using AI right now for just getting deeper interviews with the consumers that are part of our experiments.
So makes sense.
We have thousands of consumers go through our platform to measure the impact of upper funnel and mid funnel creative. But often they give us a few answers. They love the product, they don't love the product. We can see how that moves statistically. That's kind of the key metric. But we follow up with some questions. Why did you like it? Why did you not like it? And when you don't have the AI, they kind of give you an answer, and some of them are useful. But when you have got the AI, now the AI can interview them.
Yes.
Like, oh, hey, you said that you didn't like that. Why didn't you like that? And suddenly they're like, oh, okay, it's kind of a real dialogue here. And now we've got a whole bunch of information we weren't going to get from that human. So you get more from the humans.
That's a great perspective. Catherine, what do you think?
I mean, I'm also very excited about it, and I do think it actually has, great potential to change the anatomy of how work happens in marketing, and I think more so than some of the other advances in technology. I am cautious though, because I do think we're, at the very early stages of this, and I think right now there's a lot more questions than there are answers.
Mm-hmm.
And I do think like there are risks of kind of shiny object,
Right.
syndrome happening right now of folks trying to get, the brightest thing, the thing that they can get the buzz around, because there is a lot of hype and excitement around it. And I think, we have to counsel our clients to kind of move beyond that and really, plan for multiple scenarios almost of what may or may not happen. But I do think fundamentally at the core, and we just published some research on this a few weeks ago, which is that we do think it's going to be an accelerator. We do think it's a catalyst. We do think it's kind of pulling forward when we thought we would recognize a lot of the benefits of AI by itself. And we think it has kind of amplified it. I think our latest research is that up to $4.4 trillion of annual value can be unlocked by this,
Wow.
which is the size of the UK GDP,
Gee.
right? So I do think it has a tremendous amount of potential, but I do think, you need to be smart with how you go about it and not kind of fall into the trap of, 1996 and 2001. And how do we actually, prepare our clients to set up for this?
You talked about risks, Catherine, and of AI, and there's been a lot written about the potential downfalls, how it can be misused, et cetera. How do you think that marketers should be dealing with some of those concerns and risks?
Yeah, I mean, it's not sexy, but I think you need to have like the processes and the governance and the protocol in place with it, right? And I think you need to have, rethinking through, okay, well, what are the approval processes? What is the kind of role of legal in all of this? How do we make sure that our brand filter and proposition is still coming through in this world? I think obviously there's going to be a lot of new law around IP, right, and copyright infringement in this new world. And I do think that just as much as energy is going into developing the use cases in the tech, needs to go into the processes and the protocols and the safeguards around safeguarding around it, because I do think it's going to be a little bit of a slippery slope.
How about you, James?
Yeah, I think I agree with all of that, and I would add, I think it places a renewed emphasis on the need to have trust in platforms
Right.
and organizations and what their underlying values are. Because I think whenever you're in a situation where you're swamped with a bunch of stuff, where you have to find the stuff that's right or that makes sense. And I think different industries have been through that. I used to work in media, and the New York Times emerged out of an era which is probably quite familiar to folks today, where there was just a bunch of tabloid made up stuff, and all the news that's fit to print slogan was a reaction to say, you can trust us. This other made up stuff, it may seem like it's getting your attention and it may seem interesting, but you can't ultimately rely on it. And I think institutions that build up that trust ultimately are probably going to win, because we'll see a lot of extra, low quality material, whether it's reporting, whether it's marketing, whether it's claims about products.
Right.
So somehow you have to, reviews of products.
Right.
People have found, reviews of products that include phrases like, as an AI model, I'm unable to generate whatever. And it's like, obvious where that came from. So, who put that there? How do we make sure that we're not, paying attention to brands
Right.
and campaigns that are not taking our values and trust seriously?
Do we need regulation?
Well, I think any new tech needs some form of regulation. I mean, I personally, this is more me than Swable speaking. I think, we've got to start by understanding where the biggest risks are.
Right.
I think everyone's seen the Terminator movies. Everyone understands like what one version of that risk looks like. So I think, you might ask yourself, what kinds of companies
Yeah.
are the ones who might be making, the Terminator and applying some of the regulation of that. I'm less worried about whether Sam Altman's chatbot, sort of shares my political views or not. I think, maybe we don't want to make the killer robot.
I do think the risk shows up in the micro, right? And I think that's where this becomes difficult, right? So I think like what you're mentioning of just reviews, right? And if you think about that as a consumer,
Yeah.
how are you supposed to understand what's true, what's not, and I do think, kind of going back to something that James said earlier, I do think like brand trust, brand DNA, and I do think like the competitive advantage in the future needs to be around a deeper understanding of who your consumer is, what their needs are. And I think obviously AI can help with that, but I do think as marketers, like we almost need to go back to the basics of spending time with our consumer, spending time sharpening what our brand stands for and what our unique value proposition is, and how do you actually have AI amplify that, as opposed to kind of a reversion to the mean, right? In terms of getting the same content from everybody because it's using the same foundational data, and then you kind of, as a consumer, are just like, what is all this?
I think think it's really exciting because I mean it empowers each of us to sort of step up a bit in the process. All of the tasks that weren't necessary. I think that AI doesn't replace people, and it doesn't even necessarily replace roles, but it
Right.
replaces labor, and that labor is stuff we don't need to do. So come up with 10 ideas, or come up with a better articulation of the values of the brand or what it stands for. Rather than sort of focusing all your energy on the executional details that we have machines that can now
Yeah.
help us with.
Well, especially with thinking about, let's switch back to the topic we were talking about before, which was transparency, and particularly in the media sense, is AI, and I haven't really seen much on this, but is AI, will it be useful in breaking through some of those particular transparency issues where some of that data has been hidden intentionally, in some cases unintentionally others? Are there breakthroughs to be had in resolving, drawing out more of the data and insights that marketers can use to make better decisions? Catherine?
I think yes and no. Like, I think that there's definitely a lot, obviously, with the power that it can do with taking a lot of unstructured data
Sure.
in, right? And you can start to kind of tie together more sources. And I think as a marketer, that can be really powerful. But I think AI and Gen AI specifically also almost like exacerbate some of the transparency issues, right? Because you're not necessarily sure of like, where is this coming from? And like, what is the foundational model and where is it drawing from? And I do think like it, for some folks can feel kind of black boxy, right? And so how do you actually, make sure you're educating your organization to, ask those questions, right? Of like, where it's coming from, what's the foundational model, what's the foundational data? And I feel like sometimes as marketers, we don't spend as much energy kind of asking in those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, there's a big series of debates going right now. How do we recognize the contributions of the creators? I mean, these models are sort of now inextricably embedded within them is
Sure.
the work of millions of people around the world, and it may be too hard to put that genie back in the bottle. But I think the $4 trillion or whatever it is that is going to get created. I think at the end of the day, really underlying these debates is sort of what do we do with this extra value?
Yeah.
Creatives have put blood, sweat, and tears into cool campaigns, and some other set of companies now may be able to take advantage of that. Might we just sort of think a bit about the distribution of the value there? What does that mean about what we do with all of these resources? And I wouldn't pretend to have the answer, but a lot of those debates are happening right now between journalist unions, business, employers of them, or right now there are strikes in Los Angeles in creative industries.
Right.
Where, that balance has eroded a little bit over time. I think some of the new technologies have sort of forced a re-examination of who gets what when, and that sort of backslid a little bit. So I wouldn't pretend to have the answers, but clearly the question of how do you divide the pie up has to be really thought about intentionally.
Well, when you think about that, look at the long tail. Do they have the same opportunities to succeed with AI as some of the larger players?
Yeah, you mean the smaller companies
Yeah.
or the creatives themselves?
Both.
Yeah.
Both.
I mean, look, I think it's any disruption I think is exciting because you can move a little faster if you're smaller and
Sure.
you haven't got so much invested in the
Yeah,
current way of doing
that's a good point.
things. But it takes a lot of resources to train some models, and
Yeah.
What do you think,
No,
Catherine?
I mean, I do agree in some ways it is an equalizer. And I do think sometimes, some of the smaller companies can take advantage of these things. And I think especially with, a lot of the Gen AI right now, a lot of it being kind of open source does give a lot of folks, greater opportunities. And I do think sometimes the bigger companies struggle with the change management that needs to happen here.
Right.
But I do think at the same time, they are the ones that typically have, more data, whether or not that's clean enough for them to use. But they, they do have history. They do have, more consumer data that they get to play with. And so I think it'll be interesting to see, how this plays out.
So let's bring this to a close, and I'm going to ask you both one simple question. If you had the ability to speak to the community of marketers, what kind of advice and counsel would you give them? Catherine, let's start with you.
I think I would say it is probably similar to what I said as it related to some of the data pieces, right? Which is like, don't get caught up with the shiny objects right now. I do think like go back to what are your hero use cases? What are you actually trying to solve for with this? Don't overlook kind of the process implications of this, the new talent that you're going to need. How do you embrace the change management aspects of this? Because I do think there is a lot of anxiety in the system right now and a lot of questions. And I think making sure that you're being thoughtful about the people that are part of this,
Right.
And not just focused on kind of the shiny tech, but the infrastructure, the processes, the relationships, the new training that you need to have. And then again, planning for multiple scenarios here, because I do think we're still, very much in the early days here. And so making sure that you're you're not locking yourselves into a corner.
Excellent. James, you have the last word.
All right. I guess I'd say, we're moving from an era of big data into one where people are asking, look, do I have the right data?
Yeah.
And I think, that if you're running any part of a business, you should know what the business objective is for that part of your operation or the work that's being done. So, our counsel would be make sure that question's been very, clarified very, very, very well. And then ask the teams around you, providing you data, providing you evidence, is that evidence that I'm getting what I want? This is a campaign. It's designed to make people love my product. Is it doing that? If you ask really simple clarifying questions like that, I think you'll, be led towards better solutions technically on, data and AI platforms and really, in life in general, that you're probably going to grow more and achieve those goals.
Well, those are great insights. I think you've given us a lot of lessons and a lot of insights to think about. So, James, Catherine, thank you very much for being with us and sharing your thoughts.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you.